Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today you've handed us a really fascinating source excerpts from Gavin Kennedy's book, Adam Smith, a moral philosopher and his political economy.
It's a great one. Really gets under the skin of who Smith was.
And our mission here is to unpack this, pull out the key insights, and maybe help you see Adam Smith a bit differently, beyond just the father of economics label.
Definitely. Prepare to challenge some assumptions. Kennedy really emphasizes how different Smith's work feels compared to modern economics.
It really jumped out. You read Wealth of Nations, and it's not packed with equations like a modern textbook.
Not at all. The source calls it literary, sometimes a bit dense, even has these diversions.
Right. So imagine a grad student today, immersed in general equilibrium theory.
They'd likely find Smith's whole method entirely different, maybe even disturbing, as the source puts it.
Disturbing. Why disturbing?
Well, because he wasn't starting from abstract a priori principles, these sort of pre-assumed truths. It wasn't theory first in that sense.
So if not from abstract theory, what was he doing?
He was synthesizing, really, pulling together existing knowledge, history, observation, and crucially, he was writing for a specific audience.
British legislators, right, and the people influencing them.
Exactly. He was trying to persuade them.
And persuade them about what, specifically? Because it wasn't just government bad, was it? That's the common myth.
No, absolutely not. He wasn't anti-government on principle. His target was very specific. Government actions that blocked commerce based on what he saw as false doctrines.
Like mercantilism, that idea of hoarding gold.
Precisely. Mercantilists, protectionists, monopolists, those were the groups whose ideas and policies he argued against because they stifled wealth creation.
And he lays out this vision of the commercial age in Wealth of Nations, tracing society's development.
Through 5 books, from hunter-gatherers onward. And for him, the defining thing about this commercial age was the division of labor.
Driven by what?
By what he called the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. That innate tendency to trade.
So exchange is the absolute core.
For Smith, yes. The source highlights this as quite different from modern neoclassical economics, which often focuses more on economizing, making rational choices under scarcity. Smith saw exchange as the defining feature.
Not just in markets, but socially, too.
Yes. Social, moral, economic relationships exchange was central.
It's kind of amazing how these core issues are still the big debates today. Free trade, protectionism, markets versus state.
Poverty solutions. The source points out these are still divisive intellectual and practical challenges. We're still wrestling with them.
So why bother with Smith today if his methods are so different?
Because the questions he asked are still our questions. How does society work? How do we create prosperity? How do we help the poor? These are fundamental, even if our tools have changed.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's dig deeper into that broader view. The source stresses seeing him as a moral philosopher first.
And 18th century moral philosophy was a much bigger field than just ethics today. It covered natural religion, ethics, jurisprudence, the study of law.
It was a whole system of thought.
Right. And the source argues his big works, Moral Sentiments, Jurisprudence, Wealth of Nations, they are just separate books. They're a connected oeuvre with common threads running through them.
Interesting. So how did this moral philosopher try to understand how society or morality developed? The source mentions conjectural history.
It's a fascinating method. Since you don't have written records from the dawn of time,
Right.
Smith would use what he knew about human nature and current society to make educated guesses, plausible speculations about how things like language or social rules might have evolved over long periods.
He did this in an early essay on astronomy, too.
Yes, tracing how ideas about the cosmos changed. It shows this way of thinking was consistent for him.
And what was the point of philosophy in his view? What was it for?
He saw it, in that astronomy essay, as a way to bind disjointed objects, bring order into this chaos, calm the tumult of the imagination. It helps us make sense of a confusing world.
Moving from superstition to explanation, maybe?
Sort of, yes. Replacing reliance on invisible gods with more systematic thinking.
Okay, here's a really key insight from the source. This philosophical method, this conjectural history, it laid the groundwork for his idea of, well, unplanned order, right?
Exactly. Systems evolving unintentionally, unconsciously from the bottom up.
And the source mentions Jim Addison generalizing this as Smith's exchange model.
Yes. And this model isn't just for economics. It applies to how morality evolves, how language develops, how the division of labor emerges. all slowly, through successful, repeated interactions, exchanges not from some grand design.
So this kind of cuts against the idea of a social contract being necessary to create society, like Hobbes thought.
Right, Smith didn't see humans starting in some solitary, brutish state and then deciding to form society. His view, based on the source, is that we're born into societies, however small or basic they might have been initially.
Society is the default, not the invention.
Pretty much.
It evolved with us.
And for those early groups, what was the absolute rock-bottom rule for survival? Just that. Survival. Enforced by action, habit, instinct, more than complex reasoning. That urge to live is fundamental.
There's that really stark quote, the source pulls from moral sentiments.
Oh, yeah. No social intercourse can take place among men who do not generally abstain from injuring one another.
He even says societies of robbers and murderers need that basic rule among themselves.
It's powerful, isn't it? But his point is profound. This minimal level of not harming each other is the absolute bedrock. It allowed societies to hang together and evolve.
And morality itself emerged from that process, not before it.
Exactly. Moral sentiments, our sense of right and wrong, weren't handed down from on high. They evolved through millennia of social interaction captured in that exchange model.
So how does that work for an individual? How do we develop these moral sentiments? This leads to the impartial spectator, right?
Yes, one of his most brilliant concepts for moral
The
sentiments.
source uses his mirror metaphor. Can you explain that?
Smith says, imagine someone totally isolated. They'd have no way to judge their own actions or character, just like you can't see your own face without a mirror. But put them in society, suddenly they have that mirror. The reactions, the expressions, the behavior of other people reflecting back judgments.
And this starts really young, watching our parents or family react.
Exactly. Kids learn what reactions, what passions are seen as appropriate or not by observing approval and disapproval.
The source mentions Robert Burns' line, to see ourselves as others see us, but contrasts Burns' pessimism with Smith's view.
Burns implies we can't really do it, we're too vain. Smith is more optimistic. He thinks we do have this capacity, through the impartial spectator, to see ourselves somewhat objectively.
And we can learn to use it better.
Right. We can exercise that power.
Where does that power come from? Our conscience?
Essentially, yes. Our inner judge. Smith admits it's fallible, prone to self-deceit.
He was quite blunt about self-deceit, wasn't he?
He called it the fatal weakness of mankind, the source of half the disorders of human life. He said if we really saw ourselves as a truly impartial observer does, a reformation would generally be unavoidable. We couldn't stand the sight.
Wow. So we care about our reputation, about how we appear.
Deeply. Others are our looking glass. We imagine how an impartial spectator would scrutinize our conduct, seeing it through their eyes, not our own biased ones.
And that imagining helps us adjust our behavior.
If we want less criticism and more approval from that inner spectator, yes, it's a constant, subtle process of refinement.
Building on that, how does this interplay lead to social harmony and, crucially, to justice? Let's start with sympathy.
Smith's use of sympathy is broader than ours. It's not just pity.
The source says, fellow feeling with any passion, whatever. So feeling joy with someone too.
Exactly. Maybe empathy is closer today, though scholars debate it.
And it's about proportion.
Yes. We sympathize when someone's reaction seems proportionate to the cause. If they freak out over nothing, our sympathy fades. The impartial spectator judges that proportion.
And this leads to harmonizing influences.
Think about it. When you share strong feelings, say, intense anger or joy, you naturally adjust how you express it depending on who you're talking to, a close friend, an acquaintance, a stranger.
You sort of moderate it, flatten it, as Smith says.
Right, you bring it to a level the spectator, the listener, are capable of going along with.
So society's harmony isn't perfect agreement.
No, Smith says it's not unison, but it can be concords. Tolerable levels of difference. It's why we can walk through a crowd without being constantly afraid of everyone.
And the source points out this is reciprocal. It's not just the person feeling the emotion who moderates.
No, the observer also moderates their potential judgment by trying to imagine themselves in the other person's shoes.
I see. Spectator imagines player.
Yes. This constant mutual adjustment helps tone down extreme passions and allows for smoother social interaction.
And this whole framework underpins the rules needed for society, especially justice.
Justice, for Smith, was non-negotiable. Society couldn't survive without it. He distinguished it sharply from other virtues like charity or generosity.
How so?
The rules for virtues like generosity are fuzzy, loose and inaccurate, full of exceptions. But the rules of justice, don't steal, don't harm, are precise, accurate in the highest degree, like grammar rules.
So the impartial spectator works strongly where justice is concerned.
Yes, and it's reinforced by external judgments, juries, magistrates when the internal check fails.
The source mentions the development of property really upped the stakes for justice.
Absolutely. In early hunter-gatherer societies, there wasn't much property to fight over. But with herding, farming, and accumulated wealth came stronger motives for harming others. Envy, malice, or resentment, as Smith put it.
And you made that really stark point about inequality.
For one very rich man, there must be 500 poor. And the poor feel that indignation driven by need and envy.
Which leads to his famous line about the rich needing protection.
It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property can sleep a single night in security. He argues that the very existence of significant property requires civil government to protect it. It's a very pragmatic grounding for the state.
Let's swing back to wealth of nations and how that wealth gets created. The division of labor is key.
Absolutely central. The pin factory example is famous for a reason.
One worker makes maybe 20 pins, but 10 specializing make 48,000.
Something like that, yeah. A massive jump in productivity.
And the woolen coat example takes it even further.
It shows the sheer number of people, trades, locations involved globally just for a simple coat. Shepherds, weavers, sailors, miners, tailors, dozens, hundreds maybe, all enabled by specialization and the extent of the market.
The market for everything involved, not just the final coat.
Right. And Smith saw three main benefits. Workers get better at their specific task, dexterity, they save time not switching tasks, and simplifying tasks makes it easier to invent machines.
But crucially, this wasn't planned from the top down.
No, that's vital. It emerged from individuals acting on that propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. People had surpluses, they traded, and specialization naturally arose where it was mutually beneficial. That's why wealth spread unevenly. It depended on the opportunities for exchange.
And the source connects us back to Audison's broader marketplace model again.
Yes, showing this isn't just about economics, it's a general model for how order emerges in language, morals, ideas through decentralized exchange.
What about the actual act of bargaining?
Smith saw it as the necessary means for strangers, people who don't necessarily care about each other personally, to cooperate peacefully for mutual gain.
How does that link to the impartial spectator?
It's a similar dynamic. In bargaining, you have to moderate your pure self-interest, your desire to get the best possible deal for yourself. You have to find an agreed valuation.
So it's not just pure selfishness driving the deal.
No, the source says, selfishness is not the driver of joint decisions. Bargaining is a social interaction. Mediating conflicting wants to find common ground. It requires give and take.
Let's touch on value and wages. How did Smith see value?
In early societies, he suggested it was about the labor involved, the toil and trouble. Later, with property and capital, it gets more complex. Labor, profit, rent, all play a role. Money just becomes the practical measuring stick.
But the bigger point wasn't the theory itself.
No, the key takeaway, according to the source, is that the system of exchange and division of labor meant even the poor in a commercial society had access to far more goods than anyone, even chiefs, in much poorer societies. Materially, they were better off.
And wages. He saw bargaining as an unfair contest.
He did. Employers could usually wait longer than workers who needed wages to live. Unemployment also kept wages down.
But then he argues for high wages. Why?
Not primarily out of sentiment, but out of the employer's self-interest. He argued higher wages motivate workers, encourage the industry of the common people. Better paid workers are more productive.
And this connects to his fundamental view on growth and poverty.
Yes, that powerful quote. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable.
And the equity point.
It is but equity besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. Growth was the means to lift the majority.
He also looked at why wages differed: difficulty, trust, steady work.
Right, but he was really harsh on unnatural inequalities caused by policy. Things like apprenticeships restricting entry to trades or the law of settlements.
That law restricted poor workers from moving to find work.
Yes, he called it an evident violation of natural liberty and justice that cruelly oppressed the poor. It showed how government rules could actively hurt people.
The source mentions his biographer being questioned about these potentially inflammatory passages.
Yeah, Dugald-Stewart. It shows these ideas were seen as quite radical, potentially dangerous to the established order back then.
So the big picture is growth is crucial for the poor, and bad policies, monopolies, mercantilism, they all hinder that growth engine.
Exactly. He wasn't anti-government per se, but anti-growth hindering government policies.
Which leads us nicely to the misconception that he was purely laissez-faire.
Yeah, the source flatly refutes that. He wrote for legislators he saw essential roles for government:
What were the main ones?
defense, protecting society from invasion; justice, ensuring fair rules and enforcement; and certain public works. Sometimes maintaining the dignity of the sovereign is added as a fourth.
Public works, meaning infrastructure.
Roads, bridges, canals, harbors, things vital for commerce but unlikely to be profitable for private individuals to build.
How should they be funded?
Publicly, but ideally maintained with user tolls. The source stresses this was about utility, not principle. What works? And Scottish roads were apparently terrible then, so the need was obvious.
He also advocated for public support for basic education.
Yes, especially for the poor. Reading, writing, arithmetic through parish schools, partly public-funded, partly fee-based. He even suggested practical subjects like geometry over Latin.
So government has rules, but he was still cautious.
Very. He was acutely aware of government failure, inefficiency, corruption, and especially using capital unproductively.
This is where productive versus unproductive labor comes in.
Right. Productive labor, for Smith, adds value that replaces its cost and generates profit for reinvestment. Think manufacturing. Unproductive labor provides a service but doesn't create that reinvestable surplus. Think servants, actors, or soldiers and civil servants.
Not that soldiers aren't vital, but economically.
Their labor consumes resources rather than creating new capital directly. The proportion matters for growth.
And this links to prodigality versus parsimony.
Yes. Prodigality is spending on immediate consumption, using up revenue. Parsimony is saving and investing that revenue in productive labor, which increases the capital stock for future growth. Prodigality makes a country poorer over time.
And government spending, especially debt from wars, is often prodigal.
That was his view. It diverts capital to unproductive uses. He thought taxing for wars immediately might make people less keen on starting them, feeling the cost up front. He was generally skeptical governments could be truly parsimonious.
And his reform agenda was largely about removing government barriers.
Yes, abolishing apprenticeships, trade restrictions, monopolies, things that distorted the natural flow of capital and hindered growth under what he called natural liberty.
Let's tackle the big one, the invisible hand. Probably the most famous phrase and most misunderstood.
Totally, and the source really helps pin down its actual context in Wealth of Nations, Book 4, Chapter 2.
It's about a merchant choosing to invest at home.
Exactly. The merchant prefers domestic industry over foreign trade, not out of patriotism, but only his own security. He feels it's less risky.
And then comes the phrase.
By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention.
Crucially, the source points out, Smith already explained the merchant's motive risk aversion before using the metaphor.
Yes, the metaphor illustrates the unintended positive outcome, more domestic investment, of that self-interested decision. It's not the cause or the explanation itself. The source calls it a relatively small point.
And it's definitely not a universal law that self-interest always leads to good outcomes.
Absolutely not. Smith says, in this, as in many other cases, not all other cases. And the source highlights that Smith gives plenty of examples elsewhere where self-interest leads to bad results.
There's that point from Fleischhacker in the source.
If it was a fundamental law, wouldn't Smith have put it front and center in Book 1, not bury it once in Book 4? It suggests individuals often promote social good unintentionally, but it's not guaranteed.
And the metaphor comes right before he warns about politicians thinking they can direct private investment better than individuals.
Calling it folly and presumption. So the metaphor reinforces that point. Sometimes beneficial outcomes happen without central direction. But it doesn't mean they always do, or that government has no role.
Okay, we've definitely gone deep into Kennedy's take on Smith, far beyond the usual caricature.
We've seen him as this deep moral philosopher focused on how society and morality emerge, often unplanned, from individual interactions.
That impartial spectator concept is so powerful, our internal moral compass shaped by society.
And the nuanced view of government essential for defense, justice, some public works, but also prone to failure and needing constraints, especially where it hinders growth that benefits the poor.
Yeah, that focus on growth as the way to lift the majority out of misery is key.
And we've hopefully put the invisible hand back in its box, a specific metaphor, not some magic wand.
So what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? Adam Smith presents this incredibly rich, interconnected view of people, society, the economy. It forces you to look past simple labels.
It really does. It's about understanding how order and prosperity can emerge from the messy reality of human interaction, that constant balancing act between self-interest and social harmony.
Here's a final thought to leave you with. Given Smith's clear-eyed view of human flaws, self-deceit, narrow interests, and the potential for both markets and governments to fail, how should we approach policy today? If we want both prosperity and justice, what kind of folly and presumption, as Smith called it, would he warn us most strongly against right now?